Hello, Internet. This is the March 3rd JupyterLab Notebook Developers Meeting. We'll get started with, if I could find a hackpad. Jason is up first.
Sure. The big thing that happened this last week on our end is IPyWidget 6.0 is released. So we got all the packages up and everything, except maybe the OSX packages. We should check on that. The Conda Forge build bot was delayed for OSX. But it seems like it's relatively smooth. There's a few questions we've been answering, compatibility questions and things like that. But it seems like things are working pretty well.
Okay, I'm up next in the hackpad. Say again, Brian. Sorry.
Just many congrats on the release, Jason. That's a huge accomplishment, and it's just spectacular work.
Well, thanks for all of your guys' help too. Hopefully this means we can spend a little more time on JupyterLab. But our first order of business will be now porting widgets over to Phosphor 1 packages. So right now I think the plugin won't work with the current release of JupyterLab because it's based on the new Phosphor packages.
Got it.
So the merry-go-round keeps running around. we'll get it updated.
All right, I guess I'm up next. Spent most of the week breaking out what is the Jupyter common folder, JupyterLab common folder, into separate packages, mirroring what's in Phosphor, the core utils and the DOM utils. And then worked with Chris on, we had looked at this tool called Lerna that Babel uses to handle multiple packages in one repo. We didn't think it did what we wanted because they were using it in a way that there is a single version of everything. So if you make a release, everything gets a major release. When you just wanted to do a patch release of one of your constituent packages. But Lerna picked up this independent mode, so it allows you to version everything independently. So we went through the check on Phosphor because the base case is simpler than JupyterLab to set up, and it did work. Chris has got a great workflow going. I'll let him talk about what that is. So I think we're about ready to flip the switch on JupyterLab and break it into separate components. And it should be a lot smoother than we thought it was going to be because Lerna is providing the heavy lifting of linking everything together and making sure it's coherent rather than us trying to do anything manually. So yeah, it's great. I'm very happy with it. We might need to have some discussion about where packages live. I think it might make sense at this point to bring services in, since it can be an independent package but still in the repo, to bring services into JupyterLab because it's going to use core utils from JupyterLab anyway, and it's already released in the JupyterLab namespace. So I think it makes sense to absorb that repo. But we don't have to decide that right now. And then I suppose when we get to Ian, we can talk more about models, real-time models, what those progress is on that.
And just a few minutes or a few days or weeks ago, you were saying that services really shouldn't be in JupyterLab organization, should be in the Jupyter organization.
Right. Well, if we did that, then we'd also have to make core utils part of Jupyter. And I mean, JupyterLab, I guess we could think of it as the JavaScript parts of Jupyter, if we want to look at it that way. So once I had broken out core utils, it made more sense to me to actually absorb it into the JupyterLab repo, but still allow kernel gateway to install it separately. So core utils and services will be node usable repos, but anything above that, you start requiring a window in the document. So we can have that dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely want the components of JupyterLab to be usable outside of JupyterLab. And so, yeah, I think that makes a good amount of sense.
We're looking at splitting up the IPyWidgets repo too, but I think we'll still split it up and not use Lerna because the situation we have is multiple Python packages, which the convention in Python packages is one package per repo, much more so than the JavaScript packages.
So we'll still have one Python package for JupyterLab that will be independently versioned from the constituent packages.
Okay. And I saw you released 0.18 this morning. Was there?
That was an alpha. So a dash
Oh,
0.
okay.
Yeah.
Is
So that
with
was
the
just to
learning
signify that we have had API changes when mastered.
Okay. Are you releasing those on Conda Forge?
As of yet, no. Yeah, that is a good point. We probably should start.
Well, but
they have to be called
have a good
something
way of
different.
doing. Yeah, they don't
No,
have a good way of doing pre-releases right now.
Yeah, there's friction between a Python and a JavaScript pre-release, and they'll be independently versioned anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it'd be less of a concern when they're just individual packages, not the whole of JupyterLab. So I think it's fine as is right now. Basically, you'd have to use the Python JupyterLab. But actually, I don't know. I think about that in the short term, maybe what that would look like to use JupyterLab in the alpha sense with an npm package. But it would be a moot point coming here. Maybe just we just press forward with the changeover because it's going to be very straightforward to at least get the initial versions of the packages out, and then we can start thinking more about how to clean those up after the fact.
Cool.
So yeah, maybe it's not worth chasing that one down yet.
How close do you guys think we are to beta?
Depends on. So we have to make some hard choices about what constitutes beta in terms of API stability for plugin authors. We'll have enough once we do the switch over to Lerna and then implement the hoisting algorithm to at least have a clear story of what the compatibility looks like, but how easy we want to make that path going forward is another question. As people like Grant try to catch up with his dozen repos that are using it.
Yeah. So one question about versioning. Part of what's a little difficult right now is that because we're at version numbers less than 1.0, we can't. Well, and actually, here's a question: does Semver specify for versions less than 1.0 what constitutes API breakage? Because
yes,
greater than
every minor
Semver
release is a major version.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
so, okay,
that's right.
Okay,
It's the same. Semver is completely consistent before and after 1.0. You just have to start the number at the first non-zero digit.
okay, got it.
Right. So we lose a layer of granularity by not being able to have 1.0.
Right.
Okay, that's fun.
Yes, no patch releases yet.
Yep. No, that and I think we're not wishing we could make patch releases, so I think we're good. And so that the combination of Lerna and then this hoisting algorithm in principle would give compatibility within like a .20 series.
Well,
Like
we could decide that everything is 1.0 now, the sub packages, and then as we make the breaking changes, we go to 2, 3, 4. That is certainly a valid approach in the NPM world to do that. So we don't call JupyterLab itself 1.0, but the sub packages could be.
Okay. Okay. So there's flexibility there basically. And I guess my question is, regardless of what we call the versions, with the hoisting algorithm and Lerna together, we can offer compatibility within minor releases.
Yep.
Okay. That's for extension authors.
Right.
Okay. That's spectacular. How many? I'm just going to look real quick. How many issues we have open on the beta milestone?
Around 40 last I looked.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have a filter. So yeah, 39. Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff here, but in my mind, the big questions are that the packaging related things, and then the API stability stuff.
There's also the design around the URLs for documents. So that the issue is open. Yeah. So there were some suggestions on what that workflow would look like in terms of both creating and consuming that URL, but there's some UX questions around that as well.
Okay. Should we have? I can talk to Cameron's here working with us today. I can talk to him about that.
Right. So 1075 allow a user to open a document by URL. I think that's the only really remaining feature other than the hoisting algorithm.
Okay. And
Is this opening as a single page? Because I thought we already had linking between.
No,
we have
linking,
URL. Yeah, so this would be a single page.
It's between
single
instances
component.
of JupyterLab sharing URLs.
okay. Aaron?
Right. I've been continuing work on making the completer be rock solid, working on the edge cases. I updated the hover box to support arbitrarily nested editors. Initially, when I implemented the algorithm that picks where the completer goes, I only imagined there was one scroll bar, the scroll bar of the notebook or the console. But now we have a situation where a cell can have a scroll bar. So the editor has a scroll bar, and then it can be embedded in a thing that also has a scroll bar, because we were talking about both in notebooks and consoles, the fact that gigantic cells might actually be made to have a max height and be scrollable. And in the console, it's already that way. In the notebook, we haven't done that yet, but I'm sure we may. That turned out to be a bit complicated, but now that works fine, which is good. It means you can just, anywhere you have an editor, you could have completion functionality without worrying about its context, really. And the other thing is, I deleted an underscore that turned out to be important. So we're going to have to do a backported patch release to put that underscore back in. Let's just say that. Yeah, I guess that's it for me.
Great. I've been working on some design things for the cell and the prompts, and at least wanted to bring those up and get a quick. Two of them are there. So the first one is 1825. So one thing that has come up is the desire to have some per cell UI for really common actions. So this issue that's listed here, some of the common actions would be like run cell, clear cell output, and then I'm not sure all these should be per cell actions. And I've been starting to work on some of the UI questions about how to expose that. I don't want to adorn cells with a lot of UI. It needs to be extremely subtle and minimal. And some of it may even be like a right-click context menu. And then, so my question is, from an implementation standpoint, this type of UI, I don't think should be in the cell view. It's more notebook level stuff. Now, some of the actions would be per cell, some of like clear output. Others would be at the notebook level. For example, Like if we wanted a button that just inserts a code cell or markdown cell below that cell, or delete cell. Well, delete cell, I guess, is that a notebook level action or cell level action?
Would be notebook level action. You're changing a list of cells.
Yeah. Okay. And so so the question is, what's the model? Like, where would we put that code? And part of it is, if we can get enough of a stub in, I can then start to work, like basically play around with different ways of exposing those actions and those UIs from the design perspective. So thoughts on that?
So the way it's done in Interact is there's a hover that comes over the top of the cell as you're editing. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's probably going to be the appearance of the UIs will probably be triggered on hover. Like one example that I've played with just visually would be if you hover over the prompt, the input prompt, it turns to a play button and you can just click that to run the cell. Like that would be one example of the type of thing I'm exploring.
Or we could put a small little button off to the side so that it was more mobile friendly for an iPad or something like that doesn't have a hover. A little button off to the side, you click that and it pops out, flies out a toolbar.
Yep. So another would be like the material design has a nice more icon. It's like basically triple dots, either horizontal or vertical. And like a user could hover over that, click it, and then we could expose some small micro panel of actions. There's, and I'm trying here to ask more the implementation of sort of, if we want to start to play with these types of things, is there an API, or sort of what does that look like? Where would we start to plug that in at the code level?
It could be just like Cell Tools in that it's another plugin that uses the notebook tracker to then drill down to the active cell, and then from there it can adorn the editor widget. So it has all the information it needs to add that content.
And so would it just do like directly inject things into the DOM, or like how would it?
For example, the tooltip is doing that. So it has an editor that it's referring to, and it's injecting a hover box into the DOM that is attached to that editor. So this Cell Tools editor could have the same concept.
Do we have the hover box abstracted out? Like we were thinking about trying to use a hover box in some iPyWidget stuff. It'd be really handy.
Well, no, right now it's attached to a code editor interface because it provides the things we need for interaction. And Darren can talk more about that.
Yeah, hoverboxes need to know the cursor position because that's what they care about. They base where they land on the screen based on where the cursor happens to be.
It'd be nice if.
Yeah. So what would you?
We could abstract that into two layers. One that provides the cursor position, the other one that just draws the box. I think is what Jason was asking.
Yeah. If we have an abstracted out phosphor widget, say that does the attached to DOM at the root node, floats above things at a given position, etc. That would be really handy for us in iPyWidgets as well. And handles the scroll events and stuff like that. We were.
Yeah, so that base one could go in DOM utils.
The scroll events actually, hoverbox is actually just a function called setGeometry, really. The scroll events, what you do is you, as the owner of the thing that's going to hover, all you do is you attach document-wide scroll listener, not on a specific node, on the whole document, and then you make your scroll listener call that setGeometry function. So what I can do is make that set geometry function no longer require an editor, because currently it requires an editor. But it would still be your responsibility to hook up to it. But it should be not that onerous to do.
Yeah, I was thinking of something like a generic phosphor container that would on display, float above the document somewhere at a given position, and there's some way to set that position, and it automatically handles scroll events either by disappearing or by scrolling a particular amount. Basically, some way of providing a nice modal tooltip-like box, sort of the logic abstracted out into some base phosphor container that we could just put whatever content we wanted in.
So you want a widget, not just a function. This function actually really only cares about a node, and it operates on the DOM. The idea being that doing it on that lower level gives you a lot more flexibility because all it is a DOM util. But if I have that DOM util, I could easily build a phosphor widget on top of that DOM util that internally uses it this way, and then you could use that phosphor widget to do whatever you like. I still think there's benefit to keeping that function strictly DOM only, but if you want a phosphor widget, fine, I can build one on top of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean those both can go in DOM utils as well. If the editor is out of it, then it can go to that level.
You know what? What I would probably do is create a class called Hoverbox. And just put, because I already have a namespace called Hoverbox with that function in it. I would create a class also called Hoverbox because that sounds like the name of a widget anyway. And you could instantiate either a new Hoverbox or call Hoverbox.setGeometry when you like. I'm sorry, Chris, what did you just say?
I was going to say, it sounds like something reasonable to put into Phosphor proper so that it can be used by JLab or IPy widgets.
That'd be awesome, because then, yeah, then we wouldn't have to depend on JLab for IPy widgets.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could still depend on core utils and DOM utils. That's the intent of those.
We're splitting everything up, the point. Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, Phosphor is a good place for that particular function.
Yeah. But just to clarify, though, I don't think that in any way is needed or is relevant in the per cell UI. In that the notion of hover here is different in that you need a fixed persistent DOM node in the cell structure that when the user hovers over it, it appears.
Well, you got to be careful with having something relative inside the DOM nodes, because if you have a parent that is overflow hidden, it'll get cut off. So that's the issue we're finding right now, for example, in BQplot with our hover things, is that if we're inside of a tab widget, inside of IPy widgets with overflow hidden, then it gets cut off because it clipped to the boundary of the container. So if you want something that really is hovering over everything, then you'll want something that's at the root document node or somewhere above any container. I don't floats out.
I mean,
okay.
This UI would be. I mean, the two broad classes of UI that I'm looking at. One would be just a context menu, which is that's a very different beast. The other would be actual UI that's fully contained within the cell.
Okay. And if it happens that the cell is small because the window's squeezed in tight, etc., you want that UI clipped?
No, I mean, whatever UI I would come up with would fit within all of those constraints.
Okay. And it may, if it's like a row of toolbar buttons, it may introduce a scroll bar and be clipped inside of the cell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is what it's a pretty hard design. And this UI is going to be extremely subtle and small by necessity. The other thing that isn't clear is that some of this may appear only when a cell is selected. Others of it might appear anytime you hover over a cell, even if it's not selected. And so I think part of my question is, I think this UI is going to have to be very tightly integrated with the DOM structure of the cell. and it may even involve changing the layout of the cell itself in some way. So for example, like you could imagine there being in the far right of a cell, ... to indicate more. When you click it, the width of the code mirror element becomes a little narrower and exposes some buttons underneath.
And
like
and that's where your question of what's the right API to decorate a cell for external things like the notebook to drill it down into a cell and decorate it.
Yeah, and so, or like replacing the prompt with a play button when you hover over it. Like that's a pretty, that's not some hover thing that you're putting on top of the cell. You're literally mutating the DOM of the cell itself. And now maybe we need a subclass of the cell view that has this extra UI. That may be the answer.
I mean, we've already got the ability to swap out the rendered code mirror part. So if it sounds like we're just asking for more things to be swappable at runtime, and that's a fair ask.
Well, this is more than, you mean swapping out the code mirror for this like
Well,
code
Markdown
mirror
widget does that.
button type of thing?
So the Markdown cell widget is already doing that. So there's an API exposed in the root cell that says, I want to replace what is the editor with my thing. And so that's what the Markdown widget uses.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we can continue this. I at least wanted to bring it up. And then I'm also working on some just more general visual design stuff of cells in 1742. I'm going to keep poking away at that. I don't think we're anywhere making a decision. And then one other question I had is, I visited LSST 2 weeks ago, and they indicated that having named sessions in JupyterLab would be a real quote, game changer for them. And my question was, how difficult would it be for us to offer named sessions, but only expose them through URL query parameters? Like, in the URL.
As in the widgets that are opened, encoded in the session?
Yeah. And in other words, not offering an actual UI for it right now, but just embedding the session name or clearing of a session or a new session in the URL query parameters.
That sounds, Darian, like sort of what you did with the state database, right? You can give it a new top-level name, and we can just rehydrate that?
Yeah, that's right. You can. There's this concept. I kind of wish I hadn't used this word, but it seems like the right word, of namespaces. You give the state database a namespace, and then everything that it stores is stored with that as a prefix, but it's totally transparent to you. You just create a new state database with namespace equals foo, and then when you add keys, you don't give the foo. You just give the bar or whatever. And when you get bar, it actually looks inside the state database for foo.bar.
And so that's already there?
Yes.
Okay. So it would basically be a matter of exposing that namespace name in the URL.
In the URL. Yeah, you could have a URL fragment, I guess. Here's the thing about URLs. We should be very careful about what we put into URLs. They have a way of lasting forever. If we make a mistake today, that might have consequences. So certainly something belongs in the URL. Some amount of our state has to go there because we want to share things with people. I just think it requires real discipline, because you could easily cram a lot of stuff in there because it'll solve a problem really quickly. That's all I'll say about that right now.
Where else would we store the name of the session? I mean, I guess we could store it in a cookie and then provide a UI for switching sessions based on that.
Yeah, you could store it in the state database itself. You could store it in the main application level database. You could store it in whatever setting system we end up building, or you can store it in a cookie. Or you could not. You could have all the different ones available to you in some sort of drop-down UI that is read from the state database. But keep in mind, state database, every single time there's a version change, will delete everything. So if you're constantly installing new JLabs, you're going to blow away your state database all the time. And state database is tied to that browser that you last used, especially if you're using incognito mode, that's going to go away. So all of those things are factors.
It makes sense for me to have the state database on the server side.
Oh, sure, but we needed something to do that. And so we created an interface for state database. Yeah. We created an interface for state database that allows for swapping out the backend, but the current backend is local storage.
Sure, right.
Gotcha. Would switching sessions require reloading the page?
What does it involve to switch a session? What is the thing that happens when you've switched a session?
What's in a session?
That's
the open documents. Yeah, basically the layout of the UI.
Layout, the current document.
Currently, yes, but we can imagine all of the things we need are the life cycle of restoration is all predicated on promises given by the application object for when it's loaded, for the plugins for when they're loaded, and for the instance trackers for when they're done rebuilding things. There's no notion of which things should we rebuild, but we could add another stage in there, which is what session should I restore? But it has to be automatic, I think. That can't be a UI. So if we want to do it with a UI, we'd probably have to do a page refresh, because it would have to be like, all right, I'm going to set this thing, now go rebuild yourself. So this is why I think your initial intuition about URL does make sense, because URL would remove that step, right? And maybe that's okay. I mean, maybe session is a thing that belongs in URLs. I'm not sure, but
I'll open an issue.
At least, okay. The way I can imagine it right now, those do seem to be like, if you want to give a UI, it probably does require a page reload.
Okay. We should.
Here's the back of the envelope, literally on a napkin, notes from when Ben and I talked about a lot of this at SciPlan last year, and I just typed it into a comment that I've been meaning to type up for 6 months now. Anyway, I see all of you on it. And our conclusion, which, yeah, you probably remember these, Jamie, that the JLab URL should have a session ID, and it should be a refreshing thing. Anyway, those were just preliminary discussions about it all. Obviously, it's moved far beyond that with Darian's actual work on it, but I put it in a comment and CC'd you all on it.
Okay. I mean, if there was a thing in the URL, that would mean that our current life cycle is actually sufficient and has enough information to do the right thing with very little modification.
Okay.
So that's worth knowing.
All right. So, Chris, want to give us an update?
Yeah, so I finished the port of the Phosphor, basically splitting everything up into a mono repo with namespace packages. That worked. Got the test suite done earlier in the week on Wednesday, I think it was, and spent yesterday updating the build system to use Lerna. Steve had mentioned that a bit earlier. Lerna is basically a tool that assists in managing mono repos like what we have, where you have one GitHub repo that manages a bunch of independent NPM packages. And so it really drastically simplifies our build release cycle. So what we were really waiting for that it didn't have the first time we looked at it was that independent mode, which allows us to independently version the packages within the repo rather than having one single version for every package in the repo. So that took a little bit of reorganizing the repo itself. No APIs changed. I just needed to move kind of the structure of things like where the tests lived and what the names of the folders were, and updated some of the scripts in the package.json files. But I think I settled on a pattern that appears to work pretty good. So that's in master now if people kind of want to see what things look like. Also spent a little bit of time implementing some very quick community feature requests, some stuff around JSON utils, or the JSON utilities, and a couple other things. They were minor though compared to the repo maintenance. I've got another one that kind of popped up today from Anton, was asking an additional feature to signaling that would allow you to disconnect, basically break all the connections between a given sender and receiver. So there's an issue for that if somebody wants to chime in about what that function should be named. It's a reasonable request, so I'll add it, and it's easy to add. It's need to figure out what that function should be named. So beyond that, once I finish this feature request, I'm going to attempt to use Lerna to push out new releases of everything, and so we'll get that process going. So I imagine that everything, whether it needs a bump or not, is going to get a bump just to get it synchronized with Lerna and the Git tags, so we can move forward with those synchronized releases. So I'll try to get that out today, and then other than that, I'd say we're ready for a 1.0 release, unless you want me to wait so you can make sure that the IPyWidgets port goes well. We managed to catch any bugs there. Or if you want me to add in some of these dock panel features we were talking about before the 1.0 release, like maximization and tear out and save restore layout. So I'm basically ready to cut a 1.0 whenever you guys say you're ready and want it, is basically what I'm getting at.
I would say I'm going to return to getting IPyWidgets, forking it so that we have a stable version at 6, and then moving the dev version over to the new Phosphor. If you could hold off while I at least do that, and we'll see if there's any other bugs that I encounter doing that. That'd be great. I'm in favor of cutting a release before doing the features, just because we've been waiting for this for a long time, and we can always cut a 2.0 if we need to. Do you see the features that what features we're talking about, the maximize and the tear out? Do you see them as being backwards incompatible?
No, not at all.
Yeah. So, Steve, what are your thoughts? I'd rather see a release than to hold off more, but
yeah, I'd rather those go into 1.1.
Yeah.
We're waiting on you, Jason.
Okay. After all this time, I'm the blocker. Got it.
Come on, get it together, Jason. Ian.
Yep. So I'm at Cal Poly today. I'll be meeting with Brian and Cameron and talking about real-time collaboration, both from a UI perspective and from an implementation perspective. So I'll try to keep on top of posting meeting notes and photos of Blackboard sessions as things go along to keep people in the loop.
I'll be around too. Each one of them.
Sure.
Yeah, that might be really helpful.
We'll certainly be having discussions about the structure of the sort of model database we've been discussing. So if you want to be Skyped in on that, that would be useful. If not, we'll just try to keep you posted. On that note, we have been talking about what a good abstraction is for having a database for live models, and sort of there's some contention about what appropriate data structures can be nodes on this model. Anything ranging from only JSONable values up to JSON values plus editable strings, and sort of having successfully richer and richer models, which carry with it some implementation problems, but may be necessary to provide the kind of granularity we need. So that's something we're trying to work out at the moment, but I don't think we have enough time to really drill into it on this particular meeting.
So one thing we're going to attempt today, and Steve, you might want to join in, is to have all of us, Cameron, myself, and Ian, install the current branch that has real-time collaboration and attempt to use it today to keep our notes in a markdown document, to sort of both start to play with the user experience, test some of the performance issues. And so like we may end up keeping our notes using Google Drive and a collaborative markdown document today. We'll copy it to a static file periodically in case it all disappears. but that may it may help you to stay in sync with us and sort of watch the notes we're creating. And so.
Sounds good.
Very good. Jamie, anything you want to update us on?
Nope, nothing today.
All right. Well, we're basically at the.
I have one more thing. JupyterCon submission deadline's coming up, and SciPy is coming up after that submission deadline. JupyterCon, we were going to submit a tutorial on the widget ecosystem, but I think we should definitely have a talk on JupyterLab, and if not, a tutorial on writing JupyterLab widgets, which may be very interesting. Maybe it may not be broad enough to actually get accepted, but thoughts?
Yeah, I can give a little update. I had a brief conversation with Fernando at like 9 or 10 o'clock last night about the idea of programmatic talks, namely sort of talks that are essentially invited, but they're not sort of traditional O'Reilly-style keynotes. And the idea would be to have our core devs give talks on the core architectural pieces of the project, so like the message spec, notebook documents. And I'm guessing sort of an overview of JupyterLab would be one of those. That still needs to be worked out. I think the format of those, if I remember Fernando saying correctly, would probably be 40 minutes. But I definitely think having us submit a tutorial on building extensions for JupyterLab or JupyterLab development would be a really good idea, in addition to whatever that sort of programmatic talk looks like.
So it sounds like you're saying don't worry so much about submitting a JupyterLab talk,
Not
but
yet.
by the deadline or whatever. But
Yeah,
but a JupyterLab tutorial would be appropriate.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, what was that, Chris?
I was saying Darian was trying to say something, but he was muted.
Oh yeah, no, nothing.
Yeah, I think that's. I think we should definitely have a talk on JupyterLab, and if it turns out it's not one of those programmatic talks, then I'm not worried about us submitting or getting something in through another route. I do think though submitting a JupyterLab extension development tutorial is a good idea, and so we should probably think online about that and figure out sort of who would want to participate and how we would approach that.
Yep. And same sort of, I don't think we need to do a tutorial for SciPy, but we should have another JupyterLab talk probably at SciPy. So let's think offline about who's planning on going to SciPy or the various PyData. PyData Seattle, I think, is the week before SciPy, just to coordinate whatever JupyterLab talks. And Darian and I submitted a talk to PyData London for JupyterLab. So
great.
Anyway.
Is anyone attending Strata San Jose?
Not that I know.
Okay.
It's coming up, right?
Yeah, so let me just dropping the events calendar into the chat. So these are all the upcoming talks. Upcoming conferences that we attend in some shape or form. So the ones that kind of bubble to the top as Jupyter events I've added. So if for the folks who are attending these conferences, if you could assign yourself to that card so we know who's going. That's the issue.
Okay. That's great. I actually I hadn't realized there was going to be a PyData Seattle. But yeah, I need to start to look at stuff like that.
Yeah, that's new. Jason, could you add that to this board?
Sure. Yeah. Or, I mean, why don't I just, yeah, we can just look at the pydata.org, which gives upcoming events. There's an Amsterdam that Sylvan's going to in April, Barcelona, Berlin, and Seattle that are all up on the pydata.org.
Yeah. Yeah, I've added some of those. I don't check that site all the time, so
Right.
when
Sure.
one gets added, to just add it to this Agile board, so we know it's on. Super easy to add the card.
Yep.
So the CFP for JupyterCon is closing on Monday. So,
Tuesday.
March 7th, Tuesday midnight Eastern time.
Okay.
Does that sound?
So we're
I
going to
guess
have
the
a
plan is
phosphor
for us
talk.
to sync up online soon
Yeah.
about this. So.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's everything for the meeting.
All right.
Yeah. Bye, Internet.